Hi, my name is Caitlin. I usually work in fine silver clay, and I'm often asked if I know a different clay that can also be torch fired but costs a lot less than silver clay. This is a great question. I hadn't used this brand prior to now, but I've heard people say that they've had some success torch firing this, so I decided to do my own experiments to see how I enjoyed working with it, to fire it a few different ways, including, yes, to find out if this clay can be torch fired. What I found is that I love working with this clay. People who have worked with silver clay can tell you it has a tendency to dry quickly. This retains moisture beautifully. I learned some things about working with this that I will share here and did ultimately conclude that it can be torch fired. If you want the details, watch all the way through, and if you want just torch firing info, jump to the last 5 minutes of the video. It's important to say that while fine silver clay can be torch or kiln fired, most brands of base metal clays, including copper and bronze, need to be fired in a kiln. Even with a kiln, base metals are notorious for giving inconsistent results, so I'm excited to see what happens here. So I have opened my first packet of art clay copper, and these are the firing instructions that come with the clay. Pause to read if you'd like. We can see here there's no reference to a torch. That is an off-label firing method, and it does tell us what temperature to fire in a kiln. I did feel that these instructions left some room for interpretation about whether the clay was meant to go into a cool kiln and ramp to full temperature, or if the clay was meant to be inserted into a kiln that was already at full temp. So I went looking for that info elsewhere and found that both ways are fine. I tried both. I didn't find a real distinction. The hot kiln method requires that you have appropriate gear and feel comfortable doing so. So make your own decisions about that. This is half of the 50-gram pack, and what a beautiful color that is. This is a tough card I'll be working on today. My plan is to work with the entire 25 grams at once. If you were to use only part of this, you would make sure to tightly wrap the portion you're not using in something airtight because none of this internal packaging is resealable. I just have to gush for a minute because this clay feels amazing. It's so moist and responsive and soft. I would use this clay every day based only on this initial impression. This is reading at a little more than 25 grams, which I assume is unaccounted for water weight in the clay. Different brands handle that differently. So first, I am going about dividing this 25-gram portion in half because my intent was to make two sets of fairly identical pieces to then fire differently and compared to each other. But I will tell you right now that I abandoned that approach almost immediately and just wound up with 6 pieces that I experimented on less scientifically. So the first thing I'm going to make is a little totem mouse because sculpting and being very hands-on with a clay can tell us a lot about the material. Then I'm going to use 2 molds and construct bales to go with them in the way that I would with silver clay. So here I'm using an acrylic roller to make a soft little shape, and this clay is so responsive. It is doing exactly what I would like it to. I'm not going to make this little mouse too complicated. I'm going to section off a head, arms, and a tail, and then I'm going to shape those pieces and attach them together. When I work in silver clay, the attaching and then refining steps are usually the most time-consuming parts of projects like these. As with most clays, when we're putting pieces together like this, if they are just resting on each other, even if we push them well into each other, they're really not going to be attached unless we wet and score internal of the joint. So that's what I'm doing here to put the head on the body. I'm doing something here that I often do with silver clay, which is to make my pieces look messier before they look neater. I'm being pretty aggressive about this joint, and then I will wet it and use a shaper and a finger to make a paste right on site and then blend those seams. This helps make the joint visually coherent and strong. Rolling out this tail is another place that I got really excited about this clay. If you've ever rolled out silver clay that is anything short of immediately fresh from the package, you might know that it can become a bit tricky to roll because it has a tendency to crack. This copper clay is feeling so dreamy right now. Everything I show you here as I smooth out the mouse is exactly how I would do this if this were silver clay. However, in the end, I wouldn't recommend adding this much water, either through a finger or a wipe. Here's a progress shot, everything joined, nothing refined. Structurally, this held together well, but along the surface there was some mild pitting that I believe was caused by adding so much moisture here into this already very moist clay. And then when it came out, it didn't actually give me the smooth surface I was trying to achieve. If I were to sculpt with this in the future, I would have to modify my techniques to involve a lot less water. I did a mini experiment leaving out the clay that I wanted to use for the ears for this whole mouse sculpting process, maybe 10 minutes. In order to see what this clay felt like after sitting in open air for that long, I would never do that with silver clay. This is still stunningly fresh and malleable and means that this clay would be a little more forgiving if you forgot to put some away, or just as we've already seen, it offers a longer working time than silver clay. This is a slightly complex attachment point, and if you're beginning your sculpting journey, I don't recommend starting with something quite so complicated. But I am finding that the ears are holding their shape and doing exactly what I want them to do. Here, in order to make that joint good and strong, I'm pulling clay from the ear onto the head. And I'm going to do the same back here, again pulling clay from the ears onto the back of the head. These are the last steps to finish the mouse. I'm making a little space to put in the paws, and here again I can just tell this clay is very much wetter than it would be if this were silver clay, to the point where it's almost mushy. So I'm going to finish this, but I'm discovering that the techniques that I use traditionally with silver clay are not translating directly. When we have clay scraps, we have options for how to reconstitute them. I'm going to use these to make a paste. I use my hobby knife kind of like a palette knife to integrate the water into the clay. The more you blend, the smoother it will be. This is something I do in silver clay to bring all my scraps back to life. Not surprisingly, I'm finding that this clay just sucks up the water and becomes a creamy paste with very little effort. Love that. I'm going to use this to reinforce a few places. I want those connections where the ears come onto the head to be really strong. It might be okay as I have it, but I always err on the side of caution, so I'm going to reinforce. And I also just want to round out the mouse's body a little bit in that area. Also, this copper clay doesn't come with a paste option in the way that silver clay comes with a purchasable silver paste, so I would be making this anyway. Then I go in with my brush tool, which I use a lot in silver clay. I put a little hair-like texture back here, which would show up if this were silver clay, but for reasons that we haven't discussed yet, I don't think it will show up once this is fired. The reason is that the instructions talk about how there will be an oxidation layer that will pop off after firing, and so I think we're going to lose anything that's that subtle. And otherwise, I think the top side is ready to go. I'm going to turn it over, and for clay saving purposes, I'm going to scoop this out. This was really easy to do. The clay had retained more moisture than I expected, and the knife cut through without resistance. After I finished refining this, I let it air dry for 24 hours. I came back to find that visual crack between the ear and the head, so I filled that with paste and refined it until when dry I couldn't see any separation. And then it was time to stamp this with my maker's mark. This is a good time to say that I'm using a dedicated set of tools for this copper work. This maker's mark is the only tool I have used on both copper and silver, so I scrubbed it well and dried it before using it on the copper, so I wasn't putting silver clay into the copper. When I say that I am drying a piece, unless I have specified that I'm air drying it, I am putting it here on my clay dryer. While that dries, I'm going to spritz the rest of my scrap here with water and reconstitute it so that I can use this clay plus what I have left to fill the two molds that I'm going to use. I'm going to talk about the results of these next steps while I show you them because this did not work. This clay absorbed the water so easily and readily, which made the reconstitution process quite easy, but then I realized caused a bit of a problem. In my experience, rehydrated silver clay isn't ever again exactly as smooth as when it was new, but it certainly has integrity and makes for a strong piece if it's well fired. By that criteria, this looks like it would have worked if this were silver clay, but when I fired this did not hang together, which you'll see. I'm suspecting that our clay copper right out of the package has a lot of integrity, while freshly reconstituted clay is weak due to the significant amount of water that went in, coming back out again as it dries. While those two pieces go to the clay dryer, I'm going to make bales using the remaining amount of clay I have measured out for this set. I know I keep saying this, but this clay is so wonderful to roll. Even as I made these very fine snakes and then went on to shape them, not a single crack appeared. Again, if you have experience rolling snakes with silver clay, you know why this is a big deal. When I went to pop out the rhino, we can see right away that it is too thin. Whether this were silver or copper, this would be too thin. So much water has dried out of it. So I used the remaining clay I have here to build this out from the front. Ultimately, spoiler alert, that wasn't enough to save it. For this one, probably by nature of it being flat, it curled up as it started to dry, which is not unexpected. So I pressed it down like this and kept doing that as it dried to make sure it stayed flat. Unlike the rhino, the knife did survive firing, which I believe is because I made it second, so the reconstituted clay had had a chance to dry a little more. And I also built it all at once instead of in two layers, like the rhino. Density of clay seems to really matter here. This is what I was able to make out of a little more than 12.5 grams of clay. And then I brought out the second portion of approximately 12.5 grams of clay. It had stayed really well hydrated in the bag. I made a second set of everything. And then I quickly made a second mouse using some fresh plus some reconstituted clay. The proportions aren't as pleasing, but again, I don't know how these are going to fire, so fast and done is good enough. Here they are, all together dried. I want you to be able to see these close up, to see the detail on front and back, so you can compare before and after. During firing, they will crack in different ways, which is interesting and frustrating, but you can see here that they are whole, integrated pieces with good joints and no visible blemishes. Now it's time to talk about firing. To revisit the instructions, the only mention of firing is to place the piece in a kiln at 970 Celsius or 1778 Fahrenheit. At first, I interpreted that to mean place your piece into a cool kiln and ramp it to that temperature, which is what I'm accustomed to do with silver. So I set this to 1778, full ramp speed, and hold for 30 minutes. What you hear in the background is the window fan that I have running to ventilate. The instructions say to quench right away to knock off the oxidized layer and to do so carefully because pieces may go flying, although I didn't experience that. I dropped this into my tumbler to quench it. I wasn't thinking about the oxidized pieces, and so I didn't remove my shot first. You should do that so you don't have to clean up your shot, but it was an effective quench method. It's really fascinating to see how this outside layer comes off. And here it is in a different light. I'm pleased to feel that it seems to be fully sintered, although tapping it on the desk is not a formal test. We would have to do a bend test to see what's going on inside. I also tried to deform this by pressing on it as hard as I could. Not a formal test either, but it didn't move, and that's a good sign. When I pressed down very hard on the ear, it didn't move much, but it did have a little give. And that's okay. This isn't designed to take this kind of abuse. It did stay firmly attached, and that means it's a good joint. We'll come back to talking about how I brightened this up with a brass wire brush, but for now I want to look closely at something that happened on the bottom side. Note that series of holes that developed in the tail. Now this tail was definitely made with fresh clay, but I can't say the same for the body, so I have a feeling that these holes have something to do with how the tail curves around the body, and because the body has a different density than the tail, when the two pieces fired, they shrank at different rates and the tail stretched, which also means that so far all inconsistencies point back to the unknowing error of adding water to the clay, but I would have to do more experimenting to find out. For the second mouse, since torch firing is already off-label for this clay, at least formally speaking, I want to try another off-label firing strategy that I know of from other base metal clays, which is to do a staged firing. That's a burn-off phase at a lower temperature for the binder, and then a higher temperature firing for the sintering. So I'm going to fire this mouse at 900 Fahrenheit for the burnout for 30 minutes. And a 1776 Fahrenheit hold for the sintering for 30 minutes. What this does to the clay, theoretically, and why this is important to other base metal clays, is that the burnout phase gives time for the binder material in the clay to fully evacuate, which means during the sintering process, there's nothing hindering the metal particles from drawing as closely together as possible, which makes a strong finished piece. We can assume that the instructions would have called for this if they felt that it was necessary. I more wanted to do this because sometimes people think this is a good technique with all base metal clays. I wanted to find out really if it would hurt or hinder the process, and it doesn't appear to have done so. There was some vagueness in the instructions about when to quench. The instructions said after firing, so I did so at 1100 Fahrenheit when it felt safe to handle them. And this one only has minor cracking around the ears and where the tail meets the paws on the bottom side, but it also has a big crack on the bottom side of the head under that oxidation layer. Silver clay fires so consistently, for the most part, that being confronted with the variability of base metals is both humbling and fascinating. The only finishing I'm going to do on these is with a brass wire brush. For that I use a little dish soap, water, and I scrub gently with the brush. What this is doing is smoothing the surface of the metal in a way that causes it to reflect light, which makes it look shiny. This is the pitting I was talking about along the surface. This is not intentional, and this wouldn't look like this if this were silver clay. I think this is due to me applying so much paste on the surface. I also think that this cracking is due to different levels of moisture in the clay as I used it. These were fully dry before I fired them. So now I'm going to do my first torch fire test on a piece that hasn't been worked so much. This is a 2mm thick slab, aside from the bale. I am going to fire this piece for 10 minutes with a torch. I chose that time because this is how long you could fire art clay silver, for example, so that's often discussed, and I want to know if that works here. I have another video about torch firing fine silver clay, and all of the tools and safety measures I cover there apply here as well. First, we have the binder burnout phase, where the binder catches and then flickers out. Isn't this rainbow beautiful? This is not something you find with fine silver clay. And this is where we bring the piece up to a steady glow and hold it for whatever period of time we've decided to fire for. As I do with fine silver clay, I am moving the torch back and forth so no part of the piece overheats. I have protective glasses on hand for this process because I'm remembering the instructions say that pieces of the oxidized layer may fly as it cools. Nothing did go flying on this, so when it cooled I started picking at it with my needle tool and it really just flaked away quite easily. Of course we can't tell if it's sintered by looking at it, but it feels solid. I'm noting the color, that bright red beneath the oxidized layer. I quenched it to make sure it was safe to handle, and now I'm going to test the strength of this, and heads up, it is going to break. Yes, it feels like a bummer after all of this work, but I hope it can also serve the purpose of giving you a visual reminder of why it's important to not rush or shorten the process. 10 minutes was not long enough. And we can look inside and see that now. I can pick at this and move the material. It's almost like a little bit dusty inside, so it appears the outside was sintered and the inside was not. For the second dagger, I'm going to put it in the kiln, and I'm also going to put the pieces of the first underfired and now broken dagger as well. So this time I'm going by my second interpretation of the instructions, which is to put the pieces straight into a kiln that is already at the full temp. Only do it this way if you feel safe doing so and have the proper tools to do it. As I said, I found later that either way is accepted by art clay. Before I try to bend this back into place, I'm going to use my first dagger that I already broke to do my bend test. So here's that little piece, and remember the first time I tried to bend this, it snapped in half. I'm going to try to bend this just with my fingers again, just like this, which does tell me a lot about the material, and I found that I was able to bend it quite a lot with no breakage. That's a really good sign. And then I'm going to turn it over and bend it back to flat, and it took that as well. So now, knowing that, I'm going to feel more comfortable straightening the other one out, although to be done properly, this needs to be done with a pair of pliers. This now twice fired bale is a different story. I think as a function of firing this twice and having an outer oxidized layer each time, it has just become too thin. Even if that core is sintered, there is not enough of it. It's way too thin to have any structural integrity. So I would say if we're firing art clay copper more than once, pieces need to be pretty substantial to start with so they can accommodate those flaking layers. This also has an amount of voids and dents on it that I'm not very happy with. These were not visibly present before firing. I also believe that this is due to an overuse of water in the clay and a reliance on paste to refine the design. As I said before, this is totally different than my experience using these same techniques in silver clay, but copper is telling us it is not the same. And finally, we are looking at the little rhinos, which I did fire through two different methods, and I'll share that with you. But I don't really think we can draw any conclusions about firing from this because they were so fragilely built, it turns out, according to how this material needs to be used, that I think they were just doomed from the start. What I did was put these both in for a 900-degree Fahrenheit 30-minute burnout phase, and then I left them both in for a 30-minute full fire at 1778 Fahrenheit. And then I took one out and I left the other one in for a second 30-minute at 1778 to see if firing them for longer is better, as sometimes our instincts tell us, though that's often not correct for these kinds of projects. This is the first one that went through the two-stage firing, but not the extra firing. And immediately I can see that I have lost one of the horns. This is the one I built out of mostly reconstituted clay and then was so thin that I built out its belly area using the extra reconstituted clay. And I'm quite sure now, as we've said a few times, that this is not a great way to use this clay. As you see, as I go about chipping off the oxidation layer, which comes off very easily, this just did not have a sense of being a solid piece, and it crumbled. This is the second one that went through the extra half hour at the high temp, and I dropped this one in for quenching, and when I pulled it out, it just immediately busted. At this point, I don't have anything to compare this to. I haven't extra fired anything else, but it would seem the extended firing didn't help. I also messed around with bending the bales, and these I did make out of fresh clay, but I'm finding that once the oxidation layer cracks off the bales at the scale that I usually make them, the core is just too small. This is very cute, but of course not useful. And the second one that I technically overfired by 30 minutes just also broke to bits. So at this point, with everything I've learned through this first set of trials, I want to make something that is minimally sculpted and doesn't use paste. So I made these little pancakes. This is fresh clay out of the package. I flattened them between my fingers. This is all I did to them. And then I'm going to dry them thoroughly and torch fire these. Of course, these don't have a bale or a hole, so this would not work as jewelry, but a corollary would be to shape the clay in a round button type mold, make a hole for a jump ring, or sculpt a much more substantial bale. So let's get into how I successfully torch fired this, because this did actually work. And because it did, I want to show you this in real time. So this is me bringing it to temperature, the burnout phase happening, the beautiful rainbow moment is coming, and I just want to wait and watch that because I love this. And then I brought it to a glow, and I held this one at a glow for a full 15 minutes. I got a little bold about keeping the heat on it, and I found, this may not be true for your torch, but I'm going to tell you what I found to be true for my torch. I found that the copper clay could withstand being in constant contact with the flame, so I don't think my torch is hot enough to melt this clay. If this were silver clay, this neon color would be a warning sign that I was about to melt my project. Because I put no effort into this little piece, I wasn't worried about that, which is how I found out that my torch doesn't seem to be hot enough to melt this. After this cooled and the oxidation layer chipped off, I could still see the details of my fingerprint, which is excellent. And then I really tried to break this, and it took quite a bit of effort, but I could. We can see inside that it appears to be sintered, but it wasn't perhaps as strong as it could be. So then I did the very same thing again, and this time I fired for 30 minutes. At this point, I'm trying to replicate the instructions that say to kiln fire for 30 minutes. I became even bolder this time and brought it to the brightest neon that I could. I hadn't seen this color before, and again, I didn't melt the clay. I'm also going to repeat that you can't count on that. Your torch might be hotter than mine. But what I found was, thinking safety first and knowing how high this was off the surface of my desk, I was able to prop the torch up and let it fire while I sat and observed it for 30 minutes. This was really exciting because this would absolutely not be possible. If this were fine silver, it would overheat and melt. It's also worth repeating that you should never leave a firing torch alone. This was within hand's reach the whole time. Then I tried the bend test again, and what I found was I could not break this. "30 minutes with a torch, holding it steady, while being very mindful not to melt it, if that is relevant to your torch, resulted in a strong, sintered piece." I could still see my fingerprints, which in this case is the design, so that's important. And it doesn't have any voids, which is notable after the first several sets of results. If the knife piece is 2 millimeters thick, the fingerprint is 3 to 4. This is what all the surviving pieces look like with only a brass wire brush finish. Here is my current conclusion about using art clay copper as a lower cost material to practice with before using fine silver clay. This clay is dreamy to sculpt with. With a high moisture content, it has a longer working time, which is great for practice and for those new to metal clay. However, sculpting might not get you ideal fired results, as it appears that the more you work with the clay and add water back into it, the overall quality might be reduced. I think this clay gives the best results when it's been worked the least. It might be ideal to use this for simple slab work or with a press mold. If you reconstitute it, wait for a bit before using it. Of course, this clay is such a low-cost material, it is perfect for experimenting and finding out for yourself. I'm stoked that this clay can be torch-fired and look forward to continuing my own experimentations. Let me know how it goes for you.